Hi, thanks for joining today. I'm Joel Odom. I'm a product manager here at Pardot. I'm going to talk about exactly what the title suggests, privacy changes and the future of marketing. I want you to note that on the slide, there are a handful of other people from whom I've stolen material today. And the point is that though I'm communicating this material, this is information that is on the Pardot team's mind, both the product team and outside of the product team in the broader marketing cloud and across our organization from all kinds of different people. We're generally aligned on what the future of privacy and marketing looks like. And we have some direction for Pardot that I'm going to communicate to you. And because I'm communicating the direction of Pardot, I have to open with our forward-looking statement slide, which says that if I make predictions about the future, I've been known to be wrong before, and plans can change. So please make your purchasing decisions based on features that are currently available, not on features that I talk about that we are contemplating for the future. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the motivation and the impetus for privacy. What is it that is driving privacy? I think that regulation is pretty well understood for most of those on this call. Most of you are familiar with GDPR and CCPA. Many of you may know that Virginia and Colorado recently also passed privacy legislation that is very similar to what you'll find in California, for example. And oh, by the way, US federal privacy legislation, this is being circulated already in draft form throughout Washington. One of these days, it's going to pop into a committee and pop out onto one of the floors, and we'll probably see that enacted, I'm going to guess, within the next 2 to 3 years. Here's the thing about regulation, though we're already familiar with it. Regulation tends to be about affirmative consent. In other words, what I mean by that is regulation says that, hey, instead of presenting a privacy policy and tracking and just assuming that your visitors are going to read your privacy policy and that they're okay with it, you actually have to pop up a banner that collects consent. So the browsing experience in Europe, for example, is different from the browsing experience in the United States, across the United States, because of this requirement of affirmative consent. We're going to see more of that, and that's okay. In Pardot, we do have our consent banner that you can pop up and show. But because the consent landscape is being driven by regulation and is becoming more and more complicated, we are also planning to introduce some new API-driven consent management capabilities so that you can integrate better third-party consent management into Pardot, and so that you'll be able to, if you desire, implement your own consent management. We're going to try to make that as future-proof as possible by releasing that. I think that's coming up pretty soon, as early as the spring 2022 release. So again, Safe Harbor, that's under active development now, and hopefully you'll see more about that pretty soon. So one talked about is the impetus of regulation. I think we all know that consumers increasingly are aware of the value of their data and that privacy is becoming increasingly the expectation. There's a lot of news since about 2014 about privacy. There was the Cambridge Analytica news. There was Facebook increasingly has been in the news about regarding privacy. So consumers are more aware of that. Regulation and complying with regulation, I think when we think about it, we know that that's the minimum bar. The better bar that we need to meet is to meet the bar of consumer standards and build trust with our consumers by being private, but by respecting privacy. But even more than that, more than regulation, more than consumer expectations and consumer needs for privacy, there's something else that will be the primary focus of what I have to talk about. And that is going to be the way that technology is changing the privacy landscape. Before I get to that, in a lot of ways, I'm an academic at heart. You may have already picked up on that. I tend to lecture with notes in hand like this. I still keep track of the academic literature. This is one that just came out just last week, presented for publication. And notice what it's talking about. This is the thing, these are the kinds of things that you ought to be aware of that are driving the thinking of the major technology vendors. Notice that this headline or this article title, it talks about CNAME. Cloaking is how it's framed. CNAME redirection is exactly how first-party tracking works. It's not creepy. It allows you to track in a first-party context using Pardot, but doesn't allow that creepy internet-wide tracking that so many of us want to prevent, that I personally, speaking for myself, agree that is not a good thing. But it is still in the crosshairs of the privacy community because it is seen as a form of tracking, even if it can only be done on a single first-party context. Furthermore, link decoration, this is where we embed information in links to help us to understand link clicks. This is also in the crosshairs of privacy experts. And what I'm getting at with this, setting up really a thesis for this presentation that I'll support as I start getting into more exemplars. And the thesis is that the internet is changing. We are moving increasingly toward a more private, more anonymous internet, and marketing technology is going to have to change. I don't think that my expectation when I follow a link is that my engagement with that link may be tracked. That's kind of what I want in a lot of cases when I click on a link, but the privacy technologists see it as a little bit different. So we've talked about regulation and consumer expectations. I've set up the stage for talking about privacy technology and how that will change things. Here's just some of the major players in that. Specifically, we're looking at Mozilla, who is very much a privacy advocate. Apple and then Apple Safari WebKit are great champions of privacy. I don't chide them for their work at all. As a matter of fact, I think they've raised the bar in a lot of ways that are good for consumers. And then Google tends to be more slow and conservative about making technology landscapes that will affect things like how marketing technology, but they are very much driving towards privacy changes. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of these technology companies and how they're changing things. There are a few exemplars that are on the minds of myself, my colleagues, and this slide just talks about what I'm about to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about Apple Mail and Apple Mail privacy protection. I'll explain what that is. Many of you probably are already familiar with it, but it's something we all want to know about. I'll talk a little bit about how Apple has gone beyond just mail privacy protection and the direction that they have not only started off in, but that we see them going in the future. I'm going to talk about what's going on in the bigger internet ecosystem, like around things like IP blindness. Then we'll talk about cookies. Where are we these days on cookies? That's talked about a lot. I'll try to bring that into the bigger context and set us up to think about that some more. So Apple Mail privacy protection, what is this all about? Well, it's here now. About September 20th was the day that Apple MPP was originally released. So it's out there. Adoption of that is growing. Last I checked when preparing for this presentation, it was around 1/3 of Apple iOS users were already on iOS 15. Which allows for Apple Mail privacy protection. Here's what it is about. Apple Mail privacy protection fundamentally is a way to obscure open data to promote consumer privacy. The way it works is that instead of downloading content, which includes, by the way, tracking pixels, when an email is actually opened by a consumer, the content is fetched and cached by the Apple Mail client when the email is first received. And there are some caveats to that, but that's generally the idea of how it works. What this does is it effectively makes it look like every email delivered to an Apple Mail client has been opened. And we see this in Pardot. A flood of opens is coming into the Pardot servers, and we're handling that well. I'll get to that in just a second. Now, that wouldn't be a big deal, except that Apple Mail accounts for nearly half of all mail clients. So we are seeing a surge of opens coming in. And oh, by the way, there's more to it, as I hinted, than just hiding when or if an email is opened. But we also see other metadata. Since the open is proxied, we're seeing metadata that would normally be used in analytics to understand email recipients. We're seeing that cloaked and hidden by Apple Mail privacy protection. What they ultimately want to do is hide all information about an email recipient from the email sender. And I can kind of get that, but it does change the way we have to think about opens. Opens for a long time have been referred to as a vanity metric. Even more so now, they're something becoming a vanity metric because of Apple Mail privacy protection. We will probably, by the way, find other email clients. Think about Google and Gmail. This is my speculation. We'll see these following suit now. So what is Pardot doing and what have we done? Well, first of all, we have, you may not see in your reports, if you're still gauging on tracking opens, you may not see actually a surge of opens, because in Pardot, we have this feature called Metrics Guard that protects your metrics data from automated activity, such as automated link clicks and automated opens. That is a little bit of transparency. It is behaving well, and it's capturing a lot of this Apple Mail privacy protection opens, at least the way it's currently implemented. So we're filtering those to an extent. So if you're wondering where's that surge of opens you've heard about, if you're even seeing maybe even a drop of opens in open rates, that could be because of the way that Metrics Guard is filtering those automated opens so that it keeps your metrics pretty level. Still though, I still recommend that opens not be used in your automations or in the other activities that you see here, your engagement triggers, your prospect scoring, and your A/B testing. I suggest moving to more active measurements of engagement, such as link clicks. And in the Pardot blog, my colleagues and I, we have communicated some of the thoughts that we have around email opens and how you may want to automate differently based on those. As a matter of fact, again, under Safe Harbor, the product team, we have a prototype of a tool that will help you to understand where you're using opens. And I think we're looking to actually release that out of prototype into Pardot sometime in the next few months here. So be on the lookout for that. We'll talk more about that when it comes. I'll need to communicate with my product team and find out where that is. But the point is, we're trying hard to find ways to help you to understand how to mitigate these changes in privacy, especially with Apple Mail privacy protection and opens. One more thing about Apple MVP, then I'll go on to the next part about Apple and their privacy changes that you ought to know about. Apple Mail privacy protection, Einstein SynTime optimization, you will not see any changes to ESTO on the front end if you use that feature in Pardot, because we have made algorithmic changes on the back end to the way that ESTO opens or uses opens. We're still effective in determining the best time to send an email, so you can continue to use ESTO as normal. We have taken care of the algorithms, and we have taken into account Apple Mail privacy protection into those algorithms. But there's more to Apple's privacy changes than just mail privacy protection. We also have privacy features that, as I indicated when I presented my thesis, that the internet and the online ecosystem is what I'll call it, because we're also talking about email. As it becomes increasingly anonymous, we're going to see more features like this that Apple is leading in. So hide my email address is an interesting one. You may not have heard about this because of all the discussion of mail privacy protection, but what hide my email address does, and this is out there, it was released with iOS 15, is it allows iCloud Plus users to generate web-specific emails that are anonymous and decoupled from their actual email address. Now, they still will, when you send an email to that email address that is generated by Hide My Email, the consumer eventually will receive it, but you may not on the back end actually see that email, the true email address. And as I mentioned, this can be done on a per site basis. So there is some concern about possibly duplicating prospects there. What you ought to know is that this is not a Pardot thing. This is across the ecosystem. Marketing technology is having to adapt to things like hide my email address. And so you should be aware that that trend is ongoing. It could possibly be indicative of a trend away from email as a common identifier, but there are other mitigations we can put in place for that. There are we have this private relay feature that has come out. And what you can think of private relay as is as something of a VPN with a few extra bells and whistles. Now, a VPN hides IP addresses. So now we're back to the www tracking. IP addresses have been used traditionally to understand account-based marketing purposes or to understand the geo from which a visitor is coming from. That's going to be hidden now. And it's not just Apple who is thinking about moving away from IP addresses as an identifier, but we're also talking about Google. So this year, the Gnatcatcher proposal, a proposal by Google for IP blindness, has come out and is gaining traction. Again, Google tends to be a lot more conservative in the way that they release these kinds of features, but that's out there. And Mozilla has had a VPN service available for a while. It would not surprise me if they follow Apple and Google's suit and come up with a way for Firefox to natively use that VPN service. So I mentioned the impact possibly to account-based marketing if we're using IP addresses as an identifier for our visitors and the companies that they're coming from. But let's also kind of think of what's more subtle about these particular changes when it comes to IP blindness. One that we're seeing that marketing technologists should keep in mind is we're seeing more movement of power into the browser and the server end. So for marketing technology, well, whereas before browsers were something of a thin client and the internet was a rich, powerful ecosystem where you could do a lot of things, including things like creepy tracking that initially spawned much of this privacy discussion. Now we're seeing the browser ecosystems working with servers on the back end from the browser vendors increasingly becoming the middleman mediating the way that the websites and consumers interact. That's how a lot of these privacy changes like IP blindness are able to work, is by using this overall power movement into the browser. I think that that's something that we need to keep an eye on. We're definitely looking at it closely in ParDot. And when I get to the end where I talk more about what's changing, we'll put that into context about what we can think of as marketing technologists as we see this shift to the browser, as the browser even becoming something of a security middleman and a privacy middleman between the servers and the consumer. Another thing that is subtle that is coming out as we start to see these technology trends and what they imply is we're starting to see that our visitors and those we market to, we're going to rely more on them to volunteer information, just like we do now with the conversion to a prospect from a visitor. More volunteering or we're going to see the need for them to volunteer information. And we're also going to see more need for active engagement. So here's what I propose to you, though, a question I want to hang in the air for just a couple of seconds. Is that really such a bad thing? Or is that kind of what we would prefer things move to anyway? It's certainly something we'll have to embrace, and ParDot and our competitors, the marketing ecosystem, we're all going to have to learn to embrace this shift to privacy. The last thing that I think is worth talking about is the cookieless future. I put cookieless future in quotes. In some ways it's incorrect, in other ways it is correct. So probably most of us on this meeting have heard about the deprecation of third-party cookies. Third-party cookies historically have been used for internet-wide tracking, and I've called that creepy tracking because we don't really espouse that philosophy here in ParDot. We are also seeing a move away, even in some respect, from first-party cookies, like doing things like limiting their lifespan so that they're not long-term persistent identifiers, even on the same website. In general, though, when we talk about the cookieless future, I think that other people who use that term are talking about my hypothesis that the internet and the online ecosystem is becoming increasingly more private. To that end, though, Google, who is in the advertising business, I just saw in the Wall Street Journal this morning that their advertising revenues have absolutely soared recently. Google is looking to come up with alternative technologies to meet some of the use cases that are out there on regarding tracking and specifically how it is used for advertising. So I want to read this particular screenshot that you have here. This comes from the Google Privacy Sandbox website. If you're in marketing technology and you haven't looked into the Google Privacy Sandbox, it's at least something that you should add to your mind about what's going on there. It is an effort led by Michael Kleber at Google to make alternative technologies to find for the use cases that tracking has been used for in the past. I want to read some of the proposals that they're to prototype and trying to mature to replace things like third-party cookies, because I'm going to move to a punchline with it. Fighting spam and fraud on the web. That's one of the use cases that their trust tokens API is meant to work with. If we move towards an anonymous internet, then we can see how spam and fraud and those kinds of things are going to be a little more enabled by anonymity. So the trust tokens API is there to mitigate that. Show relevant content in ads. Obviously, advertisers need to show relevant content. So Flock, the federated learning of cohorts, which you may have read about in the news in the past few months. Flock is one technology that they have in place to help them, that they're looking at to possibly deliver more relevant content in ads. And then measuring digital ads. Obviously, with advertising, measuring impressions is going to be important. So that's a technology that they're trying to prototype to determine how advertising campaigns, and I'm getting towards the punchline here, are behaving. And then strengthening cross-site privacy boundaries. That again alludes to the creepy internet-wide tracking. Oh, and by the way, Pardot, though in the first-party context, we don't and cannot track internet-wide, it still makes it more difficult for Pardot to track. So we'll talk about some of the ways that we're adapting to that. Now I'm going to get to the punchline, though. Notice that these Google use cases, they're really about advertising technology, not so much about marketing technology. And that is because, well, for one thing, Google is an advertising company. But for another thing, personalization historically has been done through a lot of passive engagement. And then we have the visitor journey. The visitor converts to a prospect. So that's good in a sense, but the use cases that they're prototyping shut that down in a lot of ways because we cannot personalize in the same ways. But here's what we can do. And this is my penultimate slide. I think we're going to see a shift in the marketing technology. And here are some of the ways that we're contemplating that will happen. Smees that I've been talking to. A shift in data. What this refers to is a movement to zero and first-party data. So first-party data is the data that you control about a particular prospect or consumer. So moving it into a first-party, the collection and control of that into a first-party context, Pardot is looking at ways to enable you to do that in an easy sort of way. And zero-party data is a little bit fuzzy. It's a little bit of a kind of jargonish term, but what it really means is that data that consumers identify about themselves. So I think we'll see more of a shift to zero-party data. Again, that is active engagement with the consumer. A shift in reporting and analytics. Everyone in the call has KPIs that we want to report, and we want to measure our campaign effectiveness. We're working within Pardot now to find ways to continue to allow you to report using different kinds of reporting that don't rely so much on individualized metrics, but that more rely on aggregate metrics. Again, it's not just Pardot that is affected, it is the marketing technology ecosystem as a whole that is affected by that particular shift. And that's how we're looking at over the next few years, Pardot to adapt. We're going to try to give you metrics that are then based on things that we still can measure, even if technology continues to move toward this idea of anonymity. Lastly, a shift in marketing. I've already mentioned that active engagement, allowing our customers to volunteer information and allowing them, engaging with them on their level as they control the conversation. We're looking at ways to make that more happen more actively. So we have things out there already on Salesforce Pardot. We have our API. We now have external activities, which was released in winter 2022 release that allows you to use more of your own data within Pardot. We're going to be increasingly finding ways to allow you to move things onto the server without much headache and difficulty on your end, to integrate with your bigger data ecosystem and your external activities using an API first approach. So what can you do now? I would say expect change. I don't mean to be in this presentation any kind of a doomsayer. I'm just saying that the way some of the marketing paradigm and the marketing technology has been done is going to be forced to change. We're ready for that. And obviously, if you're on this call already, then you're already somewhat informed. You can continue to be informed by reading the Pardot blog. Keep up with our new features as we start to roll out features that allow you to continue to market in this privacy-friendly ecosystem. I want to say that our strategy at Pardot is to acknowledge and embrace this change rather than to seek temporary workarounds. We want permanent solutions. We don't want just to throw something out there and hope that it sticks for 6 months or a year. We want to find ways to, as technology forces us to change with the technology. And that was my last slide. I think I have left a few minutes for questions, and they are appearing on my screen. Let me look through this and see what we have.
Yes, thank you so much, Joel. I think this has been a super topical subject. I think everybody has so many questions regarding it, especially with we not knowing exactly what's next with all of the privacy changes coming. We did have one question come through from Lucy. She says, I want to track using UTMs. Is there a less labor-intensive way to do this now that we're going cookieless? P.S. We have business units, so tracking is already a challenge.
The UTM part does support UTM. I'm not quite sure when I read the question what she means by less labor intensive. However, we support that now through the Google Analytics connector. And looking into the Google Analytics connector, you can find more ways to use UTM when a prospect or when a visitor first visits a website. I hope that answers that. I would need more context on the question to really get to the heart of the matter of less labor intensive. But look at the Google Analytics connector and see how that can support that particular use case.
Awesome. I think too, there was a question here regarding Apple Mail privacy when you were talking about that and exactly what that means. Just some clarification of, does this mean the Apple Mail client specifically, or just anyone opening emails on an Apple specific device such as Outlook?
I'm glad that question was asked because I was not clear about that. This is any email address that is used in the Apple Mail client. So it is the Apple Mail client itself, even if it is being used with, say, a Gmail address or a corporate address. The Apple Mail client is the client that's going to do the fetching of the content when the email is delivered. So I tend to use on my iPhone for my personal use Gmail. The Gmail client will not be affected by this particular change. But if I were to connect my Gmail to the Apple Mail client that's built into iOS, which a large number, if not the majority of iOS users use, then I would be affected by the change. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to clarify that particular.
Awesome. So we are kind of at time here. I did just share a resource in the chat for Pardot's blog, specifically more on security and privacy. If you have any other questions for Joel outside of this, you can reach him inside the event platform. So again, Joel, thank you for joining us, and we'll see everybody later.